And now I will turn it over to Professor Tracy Hester, co-director of the Inner Center and our chair this morning.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And thank you, Alban, for introducing us. Alban was being characteristically modest and not describing the fact that his role is helping to coordinate this annual speaker series and has done a wonderful job at pulling some spectacular speakers for us, including our speaker for today. Before we get started, a few quick announcements from our sponsors. Number one, I just wanted to first say that say a good word about the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resource Center here at the University of Houston Law Center. It's a center that is co-directed by Victor Flatt, Gina Warren, and myself, dedicated to exploring the issues at the intersection of environment and energy law, which, given our location near the energy industry in Houston, obviously opens a lot of potential areas for exploration. In addition as well, this lecture series is sponsored, as Alban mentioned, by the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Government and Law Project. And we want to make sure we extend thanks to them for making this series possible. Now, what I'd like to do now is introduce quickly our speaker before I do a few quick administrative items. This Zoom session is being held in an open format so that you will have the capacity, if you so choose, to submit questions. We will be monitoring the chat box during the presentation, and we'll try and curate and collect them so that Professor Wood will have an opportunity to answer them at the end of her presentation. If you also want to ask your question directly to her, if you could, please say so in the chat, and we'll see if we can arrange it to make that possible. In addition as well, we are recording this session, and we will be able to make the slides and materials available at our website after its conclusion. So with that, the main event. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Mary Christina Wood, who is the Philip Knight Professor of Law and Faculty Director at the University of Oregon's Environment and Natural Resources Law Center. She's the founding director for that center, and she's also the faculty leader for the school's Conservation Trust Project, the Global Environmental Democracy Project, the Native Environmental Sovereignty Project, and the Food Resilience Project. As you can tell, she's busy. Like many of us in academia, she's walked many paths. She's clerked at the Ninth Circuit. She's practiced at Perkins Coie, and she has been doing work on many fronts. But I think in her online bio doesn't do justice for her either. She is especially well known for taking a groundbreaking position in helping to develop and lead atmospheric trust litigation, especially on behalf of children and future generations, which has created a rethinking of a lot of these related to atmospheric responsibilities and how to redress them and compel action. Her lecture today sounds like it may be opening an additional front and further thinking in ways to address the same issues of how to address the climate crisis. And with that, I'll turn the microphone over to you.
Well, thank you so very much. It's a real honor to participate in this distinguished series, and I thank you both so much. And Aubin, I thank you for organizing all the details. Professor Hester, thank you for that generous introduction. And we will start right in. I'm going to share my PowerPoint, if this will work, from my home office pretty early here in Eugene, Oregon. I think you'll see this. Let me get to slideshow. Tracy or Aubin, do you see the first slide? Yeah, okay, great. Well, everybody, the topic I'm focusing on today is actually not decarbonization, it's the other climate imperative, which is cleaning up the sky. We have a project at University of Oregon Law School, the Environmental Law Center, which is trying to design some sort of approach to cleaning up the sky, and that will take up my time today, and I look forward to any questions if we have time. I'm working with over a dozen students from all of my projects, the Conservation Trust Project, the Native Environmental Sovereignty Project, the Global Environmental Democracy Project. We put all those projects together to focus on this major task of figuring out a way to incentivize and promote what we call sky cleanup. And I was very grateful to receive funding for support for this effort. So I always start my climate talks with one principle that really it reflects indigenous wisdom. And the quote that says it best, I think, is from Oren Lyons. The thing you have to understand about nature and natural laws, there's no mercy, there's only law. And if you don't understand that law and you don't abide by that law, you will suffer the consequence. I always start with this because really we are held to these higher laws of nature that we can't negotiate with. And yet most of our tools and our approaches come from laws that are over a half century old. Unfortunately, these laws, had they worked, would not have delivered this crisis that we were facing, climate crisis. And unfortunately too, they don't have the tools in them to solve the urgent imperatives that we face now today. So we have to think outside the box. And in doing so, I always remind people, this is an emergency. We don't have years and years to come up with solutions. We did years and years ago, but we no longer have that because our government squandered those years by promoting a fossil fuel energy system and not making the transition early enough to renewables. And so now we're facing the prospect of a truly potential uninhabitable planet towards the end of the century and beyond, and a possible temperature rise of 11 degrees Fahrenheit over pre-industrial temperatures. But already, despite the prospect of disaster in decades, we're facing our own disasters right now. This is what it looks like in Oregon, but every place on Earth has its own natural disasters now. They're coming at it with alarming frequency. And in Oregon, it happens to be fires and other things, floods occasionally. In other parts, of course, it's floods or hurricanes or sea level rise, heat waves, and so forth. So all of these disasters that we're facing right now, that is not from future emissions. That's all from emissions of the past. That's all from carbon dioxide that is already in the atmosphere. And so what we have to do is address that and the decarbonization. When you talk to climate scientists, they boil down the climate imperative, which you can think of as nature's laws, to one basic thing. We have to restore our climate system, we have to bring the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels down to below 350 parts per million to stabilize the climate. That's the highest safe level. And right now we are at 419 and going up every day. And so there's really a two-part response to this, and the law tends to focus on the left side, the decarbonization. Decarbonization means to transition our energy system quickly to renewables so that we cease putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And there is massive, mind-blowing urgency in that. We have to basically slash carbon emissions 45 or even 50% by 2030. And we're on our way, but that is, you know, that's a law you can't negotiate with, so to speak, if you're talking about nature's laws. And then we have to fully decarbonize by 2050, mid-century. So the atmospheric trust litigation that Professor Hester spoke about, that's really geared towards this side, urging government to take the action it needs to. But this talk and my project right now is actually focused on the other side, the other carbon imperative, and that is drawdown. The atmosphere has to be cleaned up. The sky has to be cleaned up because there's so much carbon dioxide there that even if we achieve decarbonization, we still move rapidly towards thresholds of no return and runaway heating if we don't clean up the mess we've caused already. So how much do we need to clean up? Well, that's a matter of debate. At least 150 gigatons of carbon, which is a massive amount. To do that, we focus on drawdown. We focus on drawing down carbon dioxide and sequestering carbon in soils and plants. We're going to stay pretty much on this side now for the rest of the talk. At the same time we face a climate crisis, we also face another crisis, which is the biodiversity crisis. And that too is a threat to human survival. And that too carries enormous urgency. So scientists around the world say the best way to address this crisis is to save as much land and water as possible, not develop it. President Biden has come out with a goal of protecting and preserving 30% of lands, 30% of waters in the United States by 2030. So this crisis converges with the other crisis, the climate crisis. And scientists say we have to solve both at once. There's not time to solve each individually in the first place. You can't just try to solve one and then get to the other. It doesn't work that way. But also you may solve them at you may work at cross purposes if you don't think about both and solve them together. And so our aim at University of Oregon in our project is to keep both crises in mind and figure out solutions to both. Now, there's no great way, no easy, way, no big vacuum cleaner yet to suck the carbon out of the atmosphere. It'd be great if there were, and people are trying to figure that out. There's no commercially viable technology yet. There may be in the future. Certainly, it will be needed because nature cannot possibly suck out all the carbon that needs to be sucked out of the atmosphere, but it can make a huge amount of progress, possibly even over 100 gigatons. So how does that happen? The way to do this, scientists say, is to boost the natural capacity of soils and plants to draw down and sequester carbon. And I like to think of these mechanisms as nature's own engines of carbon sequestration. But what has happened is these engines have been kind of glued up in the past because humans have been very damaging to the landscape. And so the soils are degraded, the forests are cut, the wetlands are dried up. All of these natural engines that could work to draw down and sequester carbon have been degraded. And so they need to be restored. And by restoring these and by changing land management practices, the idea is you can boost these and they can draw down really impressive amounts of carbon dioxide and start cleaning up the sky. So these are called natural climate solutions, and they exist in 4 ecotypes. There's actually more than 4, but we focus on 4 in our project, and I think for simplicity's sake, we'll focus on 4 today. The first ecotype is the forest. Conserving forests allows the trees to suck down that carbon and store as long as they live. Wetlands and tidal riparian restoration is very important. These soils can capture a lot of carbon, but the wetlands have been degraded, maybe they've been dried up. Regenerative agriculture is also important because the soil is a massive engine for carbon drawdown, but it too has been degraded through chemical applications, tilling, and so forth. And then regenerative grazing and grasslands. Grasslands form a huge part of the terrain across the country. And scientists believe that in that area too, we can practice different land management strategies to boost those natural engines that can help us clean up the sky. So there are protocols that are developed. You might call them techniques. Sometimes people call them practices. But there's these techniques developed in each of these ecotypes by scientists that bear the potential of boosting that ecotype's ability to draw down carbon, or in some cases, just conserving the ability to draw down carbon. And the leading paper on this is by Joe Fargione and his team, written in 2018, in which they set forth some of the protocols that were the leading ones at the time. Of course, these things change very fast. And I encourage you to look that up if you haven't seen that paper. So the challenge is, how do we look at broad landscapes and figure out how to change the way working lands are managed so that we restore the systems that can help us address this climate crisis? Well, I'm going to run through these ecotypes very quickly, starting with the forest. The forest can be, in some places, huge carbon storehouse. We hear about the forests in the Amazon forest, for example, but also in the Pacific Northwest. And these forests, although they're so valuable for carbon storehouses, they're clear cut routinely in the Pacific Northwest. And so you see, when they're clear cut, they not only cease to retain the carbon and do their job to suck down carbon, but they also emit all the carbon they've stored into the atmosphere. So for forests, it's a matter of conserving forests and then replanting areas that have already been kept, but primarily conserving forests. For farming, the soils have been degraded, and there's multiple techniques to boost soil health by minimizing the soil disturbance and planting cover crops and so forth. For rangeland practices and grassland, there's a number of protocols. One involves just managing herds differently, and so that they don't cause sort of desertification of the soil and dry out the soil. And then for wetlands and blue carbon, a lot of this is a matter of bringing water back to the landscape. Oftentimes the wetland area, the tidal area, has been cut off from a water source, an inland water source. And so it's a matter of taking out that diversion and rewatering the area. Now, with all of these, the good news is that there are co-benefits. There may also be disadvantages that you have to look at, but there's significant co-benefits such that in some of the ecotypes, all this would take is initial funding to provide infrastructure to farmers, for example, to change some of their methods. And then once they get going after about 3 to 5 years, the co-benefits start providing their own incentives for continuing the practice. So some of the co-benefits are enhancing food productivity on farms, definitely boosting resilience against climate change, against sea level rise and big storms for some of those tideland areas, creating local jobs, and note addressing the biodiversity crisis, because when you tend to restore natural systems, oftentimes you do address biodiversity. So for example, with the forests alone, we look at those forests as holding value for timber, and they certainly do. But the ecosystem services are immense for communities. They're not only carbon storehouses, but they also provide the drinking watersheds, biodiversity support, recreation, a lot of things. So our challenge now is to connect this fast emerging science that shows the potential of natural climate solutions. That is, the protocols that will boost these processes of nature and restore landscapes. Our challenge is to connect that science and the potential with the actual land managers. We have proof of concept in so many pilot projects. There are pilot projects all around the Pacific Northwest, not that many, but very successful projects showing the success of many of these protocols. And yet there's a big remaining gap between the opportunity they suggest and the actual land management. People are not adopting these practices at the scale and at the accelerated speed that we need to address this climate imperative of cleaning up the sky. And that's largely because there's just no organizing nucleus. These practices remain out there. People talk to whoever they know, but there's absolutely no template and no one in charge of accomplishing drawdown, so to speak. And so the matter comes down to really designing systems to incentivize people to do this and to educate people on how to do this. And you might wonder, well, why do lawyers get involved in this? I mean, lawyers bring lawsuits, of course, and lawyers devise regulations. This is not a regulatory strategy at all. So why is a law center even involved in thinking of this? And it occurred to us that designing systems is the work of lawyers. And so we took this on as a project, thinking of how would you design some sort of framework and incentivize that framework. Now, before I go on to what the work we are doing, I want to focus a little bit on distinguishing this effort from offsets. Many of you have heard of offsets, and those too involve natural climate solutions, and they've taken off. There's offset mechanisms in places around the world. Offsets basically are those mechanisms whereby a polluter through a regulatory process or voluntarily decides to invest in natural climate solutions, maybe it's conserving a forest somewhere in Indonesia or down in South America, or maybe it's restoring a wetland or paying a farmer to change their practices. But they do it on the premise of being able to pollute more. And so that's why it's called an offset. The idea, and it's a fiction, but the idea is that the polluter pollutes more and doesn't really add to the atmospheric load of carbon because somewhere else that polluter is paid for a drawdown. And so it all equals out in the end. Well, we could have a whole seminar on the fallacy of offsets. But the worst premise of it is that it justifies more pollution, and we simply can't take more pollution in the atmosphere. We have to trend away from more pollution, not justify additional pollution. But beyond that, and as I say, there's many, many things to talk about that we don't have time today. But beyond that, many of the offsets have been proven to be just phantom credits. In other words, the projects actually have not succeeded, or they have not been monitored, or they never took off in the first place. And so there's real problems with offsets, but we want to distinguish our effort from offsets because our effort gets at sky cleanup and does not use legal or regulatory mechanisms to justify more pollution. In other words, our research effort at the University of Oregon is completely focused on sky cleanup, not on offsets. But the offset mechanisms have used natural climate solutions, and there's a lot of experience that has built up around that area that we can learn from. So we have focused our research on developing a 3-gear strategy. The 3 gears are intended to work in tandem with each other. One is the atmospheric recovery framework, which we're spending a lot of our time on this year and probably will continue the next 2 years on that. The other gear is financing the framework. The framework is the overarching vision, opportunity framework for carbon sequestration. The next one is financing that, because you have to provide incentives for people to adopt land management practices across a very broad scale. You could also do it through regulation, but we're not actually focused on that. We're focusing on an opportunity framework. So how do you finance that? And then the third gear is, once you find financing, where does the money go? And this is sort of the rubber meets the road part of it. Who actually devises the projects and supervises the projects? And that would be the job of the Sky Trust. So I'll just talk briefly about each one of these gears and how they might work together to promote natural climate solutions. We decided, after thinking about this on a global scale and a national scale, we decided the most practical scale for something like this is actually the regional scale. And why is that? Because we have to somehow match the ecosystems with the sovereigns. There has to be some practical alignment between the sovereign legal systems and incentive systems and the ecosystems. And we decided regions were probably the best scale for achieving that practical alignment. We focus first on the Pacific Northwest, which encompasses Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And the reason we did that is not only because we're in Oregon, of course, but also the Pacific Northwest really stands out in several ways. We have all 4 ecotypes. We've got huge ancient forests that are massive engines of carbon sequestration. I mean, they rival the Amazon in terms of their value for carbon sequestration. But we also have the grasslands, the wetlands, the tidal areas, the rangelands, farmlands. So we've got all 4 ecotypes. And we're hoping that if we can incentivize, if the region can incentivize a broad effort towards natural climate solutions, that this region will serve as catalyst for other regions. And even other law centers, if they're interested in taking on this kind of project, will be very equipped to do so in their regions, because it turns out you can't accomplish everything you need to accomplish with sky cleanup with just one region. It's going to take most regions of the world to change their techniques to boost their own ability to draw down carbon, because you can't get 100 gigatons of carbon drawdown from any one region alone. So this has to be a global effort. But the good news is that once a region does start this effort, the benefits not only accrue to that region, but it accrues to the world as a whole, because it starts cleaning up the atmosphere that everybody needs to bring back to stability. So let me talk just a little bit about the biggest gear here, which is the atmospheric recovery framework. And that is the organizing nucleus, so to speak. There are scattered efforts, and I'll talk about the Pacific Northwest mainly. There's scattered efforts throughout the Pacific Northwest. There's, a couple of ranches that are doing amazing things in terms of changing their practices to sequester carbon in the soil and also to boost their own soil health. There's farming practices. There's small woodland owners that are managing their forests. There's the Colville Nation managing its forests in ways that boost carbon sequestration and also provide other productive benefits. But there's no organizing nucleus for all of these. These are all scattered efforts. And so what we hope to do in this year or two of research is pull these efforts together and provide a template for them so that people can learn from each other and understand what resources are available, what options are available, what support is available out there. So again, I'll stress this is actually research driven, not regulatory. The framework itself is created by collaborators and is very interdisciplinary, because you might imagine that to create an effort of this sort, you need scientists, economists to price out the protocols. You need land managers, lawyers to write conservation easements. And so our effort brings together disciplines and various implementers with the goal of accelerating this convergence of knowledge. We are supported in our school by the UO's Environmental Initiative. And I bring this up because many centers across the country could be equipped to take on the same focus. We received seed funding from the National Science Foundation back in 2019 to develop the atmospheric recovery framework for the Pacific Northwest. And it was one of only 6 funded big ideas in the nation. But that is how we got the tangible start to this project. So we are developing the community that will write the framework. And we have outlined the functions of the framework and developed a prospectus for it. Basically, a framework is a written document or starts as a written document that creates the vision for carbon drawdown and creates also the operable blueprint for implementation of those techniques. At the same time, it should advance solutions to the biodiversity crisis and provide a platform for adaptive management, so that when people learn by experience what works and what doesn't work, or when prices change for certain techniques, you can adapt the framework to those changes rapidly. So while it starts as a written template, it would quickly become an web-based template that can change over time. And it also should attract funding avenues, because once the region establishes a big vision for these types of things, it needs funding. And by consolidating these techniques, there are tangible funding avenues for funders. Okay, these are the components of our framework. We've developed a prospectus. We completed that last year. That goes through all of these components. And our charge now is to write these up, taking all of the research we've done in these various areas, and create the framework, which will then change over time as the region progresses in its efforts through the end of the century. But basically, a framework should address the region's restoration potential. How much does this region hold in terms of its contribution to sky cleanup? And then map the opportunity. Which areas would be the most fruitful for these techniques? It has to then list out the techniques, what sort of a recipe for how to achieve these actions on farmlands, forests, wetlands, etc. And then another important part would be the co-benefits. by listing and analyzing co-benefits, sometimes you can lower the price for these techniques because it just makes sense to improve soil health on farmlands, for example. It just makes sense to protect a forest for its watershed capability. And so co-benefits often draw other areas of funding, or they just make sense for the particular land manager to continue the technique. It's important to look also at justice and community needs. Sometimes there are major disadvantages to some of these techniques. You have to know about those before people decide to implement them. Pricing, many of these techniques just haven't been priced out in a generic fashion, and that takes rural economists usually to figure out how much would you have to pay farmers to adopt this kind of practice? How much would you have to pay timber owners to extend their rotations for maybe 20 years or 40 years on their lands? And then looking at implementation requisites. How do you lock in that carbon storage on that land so that the next owner doesn't just undo all of the carbon sequestration you've achieved by reverting back to the former land practice? And so you look at monitoring and technology, but also durability, carbon storage easements on the land. And that is decidedly the work of lawyers, of course. Another couple of parts of this that we're really excited about are the announcement and outreach, to really announce opportunities to land managers. Sometimes you have to speak in different terms and emphasize different benefits. A farmer is typically going to be interested in soil health more than contributing to atmospheric drawdown. And so how do you announce and how do you find connectors to make these opportunities available to these rural areas? So this is highly transdisciplinary. We're excited about that. And over the last 3 months, we have been meeting with all sorts of people around the Pacific Northwest who will help us develop this framework. We tend to categorize people in terms of their abilities to really catalyze this effort. Some are translators who can bring this opportunity to rural communities. Some are connectors, some are collaborators, some are educators, some are implementers, the land managers themselves. But we've been working, but we've been reaching out to tribes and land managers and many, many agencies. These are only just a few over the last 3 months. So basically, the atmospheric recovery framework starts a region-wide vision, and then it should be carried forth, we believe, through an atmospheric recovery institute, which would be a regional consortium of universities and perhaps agencies, tribes, to adopt this framework over time as changes occur on the landscape. And this atmospheric recovery institute could be a regional consortium that would then work with other regions around the world in sort of a concerted way to start accomplishing sky cleanup. Now, the second and third gears are much quicker to explain. I'll just run through those and that'll take us probably to the end with some time for questions. The second gear is how to finance all of this. We have discovered many areas of potential financing, but the one I want to talk about as well is a possibility. It's theoretical only right now, but financing some of this through natural resource damage actions against the fossil fuel industry. The analogy to this approach, this liability approach, would be oil spills. Whenever you have a marine oil spill, there's no question that the company causing the spill cleans up. We know that from the Exxon Valdez massive oil spill, the BP oil spill. And what happens is the sovereigns, meaning the sovereign trustees or the tribes, states, federal government, they either sue or negotiate with a polluter to get the money to clean up the spill. And typically the suits are called natural resource damage suits. And so what we need in sky cleanup is really the same kind of funding from the companies responsible for this massive pollution. The fossil fuel industry has profited greatly from this pollution and never spent a dime on actual cleanup of the pollution. Now, there are lawsuits I'll talk about in a moment that you've heard about that are distinguished from the sky cleanup ambition. We know that just about 90 companies are responsible for about 2/3 of the carbon pollution in the sky that's been emitted to the sky since the Industrial Revolution. We know that from a very landmark study conducted by Richard Heady, who identified the contribution of each of these 90 still existing companies. And so the liability for each of these companies has been documented on a pro rata basis, basically. And that liability has formed the basis for suits against the major fossil fuel polluters or companies. So what we envision are natural resource damage suits, or at least it's interesting to think about natural resource damage suits against these carbon majors to fund the atmospheric recovery plans. The suits that have already been brought, there's about a dozen of them against the carbon majors. You've heard about them and read about them. These are lawsuits brought by states, cities, in some cases entities, against carbon majors seeking damages or adaptation. And so basically, some of these suits seek absolute disgorgement of profits, but the damages would go not towards sky cleanup, but rather towards infrastructure replacement or adaptation costs. Now, the difficulty with this approach, suing the fossil fuel companies for adaptation damages, the difficulty is there's not enough money in the world to pay for all the damage unleashed on this planet by this industry. There's literally just incalculable losses across the planet. There's nowhere on Earth that isn't suffering losses. There's loss of life and property. There's economic losses, relocation expenses. There's infrastructure damage. And then there's all the secondary natural resource damages to fisheries and wildlife and forests and so forth. And so the danger is really that if these suits do win and gain money for the first few cities or states that have sued, the danger is, well, all the other communities of the world lose out on money that they need for adaptation. Is there an environmental justice dilemma here? Because the first in line would get the money for their adaptation, and there's literally not enough money in the world to pay for all the losses. Second, the climate catastrophe remains unsolved with all these adaptation damages with the few paid out. In other words, it doesn't do anything to clean up the sky. And so our thinking is that while the lawsuits themselves are sound against the fossil fuel industry, the fossil fuel industry should be liable for the damages caused. But the damages should go towards sky cleanup rather than adaptation. The sky cleanup would be in the form of funding regional atmospheric recovery plans. So we could call these atmospheric natural resource damages, so to speak. The difficulty with the analogy to oil spills is that oil spills result in natural resource damages because there are specific statutory provisions that provide for such damages. There are no such provisions in statutes that provide for CO2 release damages. But there are common law tort claims, and these suits that I just mentioned rely on common law tort claims to try to hold the fossil fuel industry responsible. And some of the suits emerging in other areas of law are actually pursuing manufacturers without statutory claims under the public trust doctrine and other nuisance and trespass theories. And so I've written about this in these citations. If you get the PowerPoint PDFs, you can look up these writings that I've completed on that question. So the most analogous, we feel, most analogous claims or lawsuits to this would be lawsuits against manufacturers of chemicals in 3 areas involving PCB contamination, PFAS contamination, and MTBE contamination. plaintiffs, that is sovereigns, they're usually cities or states, sometimes counties, are winning either motions, they're prevailing on motions against motions to dismiss, or they're getting major settlements against these manufacturers. And then the money is used to clean up the chemical contamination. One just settled recently in Oregon. It was an Oregon suit against Monsanto over PCB pollution across the state. And the state sued basically in its capacity as a public trustee, so under the public trust, to recover for damage to all natural resources within its borders that were contaminated by PCBs. And that, as I say, just settled back in, I think it was August, for millions of dollars. Now, the third gear is the Sky Trust. So you can imagine the framework organizing the effort and being priced out. The financing gear really contemplates financing from multiple sources, including philanthropy, public sources, but also the possibility of NRD lawsuits if that ever comes about. And then the Sky Trust is the third gear, which you need to think about in order to figure out tangibly how to get the projects off the ground. So the idea of a Sky Trust is it is an institution that would receive funds and then disperse funds, very much like a land trust would do, only it would be a regional Sky Trust for the atmosphere. And so that Sky Trust would actually, with the funding, oversee the projects, write up the conservation easements, and be the actual institution on the ground to carry this out. Now, there are some great analogies to other settlements involving trusts carrying out projects. One is a good analogy is the VW settlement involving massive funding to accomplish nitrogen oxide removal or abatement. And there, the trust was set up by the court, and then every state in the country got a piece of the money to accomplish projects within the subsidiary. So that bears quite a bit of valuable analogy to what we're thinking about with the Pacific Northwest atmospheric recovery effort. Another analogous situation was the California lead paint case. And there was a judgment holding the manufacturer liable for lead paint in homes. And the court decided the homes needed to be cleaned up rather than use the damages to pay for, say, medical monitoring and so forth of the children who were exposed to lead. The court found that these homes should be cleaned up. So a huge fund was established, and different counties and cities took on the job of actually removing lead paint in the homes. And that's analogous because it gets at the source of the problem rather than just putting money to the damages for the victims, although certainly those are sympathetic victims and they deserve some sort of compensation. But in terms of solving the problem, actually getting the lead paint out of the homes was a step that would solve the problem for the future. And that was the court's reasoning there. And so in sum, you have what we have envisioned in trying to think through how to accelerate and scale up a massive landscape restoration effort through opportunity is a three-gear framework, a three-gear approach, starting with the atmospheric recovery framework, which sets the organizing nucleus and the template and addresses the factors that you would need to actually create that implementation bridge to the lands that might be interested in these activities. And then the financing, and then the Sky Trust to receive the financing and to disperse it and oversee projects. And then the longevity of this effort for any region seems to require an institute. There are many examples of regional institutes of this nature. But this Atmospheric Recovery Institute would be basically the institute that would revive the information and the framework as change happens, as landscapes change, as economies change, and so as opportunities emerge. So I'm going to conclude sort of by bringing us back to the beginning, which is just underscoring the urgency of the crisis we face. It's as if humanity has jumped out of an airplane 30,000 feet high, and we have, if you will, a parachute But we haven't really pulled the ripcords yet on that parachute. And we have to now, with so little time remaining, with such urgency, mind-blowing urgency, we have to start pulling these ripcords to release the parachute in time before it's too late. And so our effort at University of Oregon is trying to think outside the box of the tools we've had in the past and try to think of systems designed to clean up the atmospheric carbon in the sky, which must be cleaned up along with the decarbonization effort in order to prevent this planet from crossing irreversible thresholds. So with that, I'd be happy to entertain any questions in our last few minutes. I think we have about 10 minutes.
Wonderful, fabulous presentation. Thank you so much. So we've had questions pop up in the chat box, and as always, as moderator, I'm going to exercise my prerogative and ask a question or two as well. Before we do, I wanted to take care of business a little bit and go ahead and share my screen and post the CLE number for everybody. I'll leave that slide up as I start asking at least my question, and then I'll drop it back down so we can answer some of the questions in the chat. So hopefully this will work. Can everyone see the slide? Thank you. Okay. So there's so many questions and such an ambitious vision. I think I'm also, might be a conversation to have at some point later, a cup of coffee. It'd be fascinating to figure out how this all interacts with some of the incentives set out in the Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which actually might provide some monetary incentive for some of the parties that you want to work with to actually step up and engage in this.
Could I answer that right now?
Oh, please do. That was more of an observation than a question. But
no, I think it's a great platform for a point I'd love to make. That act has huge amounts of funding. It's exactly the kind of thing we're looking for. But do all the farmers and the ranchers and the foresters, do they all know what's in the act? No, they don't. And so someone has to read through, figure out what's in the act, figure out how the funds are dispersed. And it turns out that is part of the implementation bridge that needs to come about. So some of this work in creating a framework, in fact, nearly all of it is just amassing the opportunities already out there and bringing them into a consolidated form informationally so that the communities can actually benefit from them. And the same is true with, say, grants from soil and water conservation districts. There's many, many grant opportunities out there, but nobody has actually gone through the work to consolidate those and bring them into a form that can easily be communicated to the land managers. So that is precisely one of the goals of the framework, to use opportunities just like that.
And I agree that it, to say the least, it is not transparent, and the opportunity, the regenerative agricultural issues alone you did a Sherpa your way through some of those issues.
Exactly.
But I'll stop sharing now. Hopefully everyone's gotten the CLE number. But I'll also then ask the question I did have in mind, which is, I noticed most of the methods you were discussing were biogenic and land-based, but you also, in one of your slides, mentioned in passing blue carbon. I was wondering if you were also looking at perhaps including some coastal or ocean-based restoration methods as well, and seeing if perhaps you might be able to tap that because of the state's sort of unique powers, even on a regional basis, to govern coastal resources or actions in federal waters.
Well, I'm certainly glad you asked that, because I definitely want to clear that up. Blue carbon along the coast is huge to our project. That is the blue carbon ecotype, as we're defining it, is all of that coastal carbon and inland wetlands carbon opportunity. So we include both terrestrial and the coastal margins in that category. And there are tremendous efforts right now in some areas. Again, these are more pilot projects, but very successful restoration efforts and carbon sequestration monitoring going on at a few locations in the Pacific Northwest. In fact, there's even already, we discovered, a blue carbon working group of over 100 professionals already working on blue carbon along the coast of Oregon and Washington. So for that ecotype, we've already got, a head start because there's already a community of scientists, land managers, and so forth.
Excellent. Well, but rather than hog all the Q&A time myself, we do have some questions in the chat, so I will turn the baton over to the first question that came in was from Hannah Gosnell. And Hannah asks, who will implement the regional atmospheric recovery plans? Are they going to be existing agencies like NRCS or new agencies? Because as she notes, NRCS already is suffering from a lack of capacity to handle the issues on its plate.
So it's not really a plan, it's a framework. So what we're developing is an informational framework, and it pulls together the information on the protocols, the pricing, the co-benefits, the justice, the model conservation easements. It pulls together all of those components of implementation, but it's not a program, it's not a regulation, it is an informational platform that is research driven. In terms of who would revise it over time, because you can imagine this on the web, an iterative document. And as things change, for example, forests burn. So as those forests burn, they're no longer available for carbon sequestration unless they're replanted. Techniques change. Some techniques will be successful and some won't be. And so you have to have that adaptation feedback in this framework. And so the institute we envision that stewards the framework over time is the Atmospheric Recovery Institute. So that would be a regional institute, a consortium of probably the universities with a few agencies. And that institute would revise the framework over time to reflect new opportunities, new challenges, new information. And so the idea is other programs tap into this. And we've had Zoom meetings for 3 months, usually 4 and 5 a day, hour-long Zoom meetings with people all across the Pacific Northwest. And I tell you, from this a little bit of a diversion, but from a law center perspective, this is the most fun research you could possibly hope to do, because, and I really recommend it for other law centers and other regions, because you connect with so many different disciplines and so many different types of people doing little parts of this major undertaking. And in those connections, what we have found is that what people really need is they need a gathering of all of this information so that they can tap into resources and techniques and partners and so forth. So that is our role in the framework.
It sounds like another reason for Victor, Gina, you and I to have a cup of coffee together and talk about what our centers are doing.
It's fabulous work.
We have several questions that have swirled in the chat box, which I'll try and consolidate, centered on the concept that a lot of emissions are actually, of course, outside the United States. And the United States is not even the leading emitter these days. If I might just ask in a slightly different way, is this a framework that you see potentially being translatable outside to other nations? And if so, is there any way to start that work as well?
Oh, absolutely. So what we hope is that the Pacific Northwest can be a catalyst for this concept. And if you look at the atmosphere as a whole, it needs to be cleaned up, but no one region can clean up all of it, or even a huge chunk of it. We can each clean up a significant portion. The Pacific Northwest is positioned to clean up a significant part, and that can be actually calculated by carbon scientists. But look at South America, or look at Australia, look at Asia. Other regions need to do their part too. So what we are hoping is through this exercise of creating a framework and figuring out this approach, which may not be workable in other regions, but at least it's a start, that we will then pollinate this approach to regions throughout the world. And they may take it and think about it and devise something else. But the idea is that we're dealing with a planetary resource. And so we must pollinate this idea in order for it to really have traction. And the analogy would be, if you take a species like the Pacific salmon that crosses over multiple jurisdictions, you are not going to recover the salmon, which are, at the edge of extinction here in the Pacific Northwest. You're not going to recover those salmon just by addressing the dams in the Columbia River Basin, or the habitat loss up in Washington. These are life cycle issues. This is nature's law. And so what we have to do is we have to step outside our jurisdictional boxes and think, what is the overall cleanup imperative? And each region has to contribute to that, just as in species recovery, if it spans multiple jurisdictions, all those jurisdictions have to contribute to that species recovery. And when I say have to, I remind people this is not a regulatory framework. We stepped outside the box and we thought of tools to create an opportunity framework.
Well, and that sounds like a promising note to finish on. As always, I wish our presentations could last 3 or 4 hours, but I think unfortunately we're down to our last minute. So before we close out, Alban, I was wondering if you could remind everyone again about our next speaker in the series, and then I'd like to thank our speaker before we go.
Absolutely. It will be on February 23, and we'll have Professor Jude Snerson from Southern University Law Center, and it will be on ESG.
To say the least, another very contemporary and interesting topic. So for everyone, again, a reminder that the slides and the recording of this presentation will be available on our website. And now, most importantly, and my most important duty as moderator, thank you for a fantastic presentation. It has been a treat. And I hope we can keep talking. And I hope you can keep talking with all of us. This sounds like important work with large, long-term consequences. With that, everyone, thank you for joining us. We will see you again next time. Take care.